Today on the Roundtable Perspective, Dr. Santiago-Valles from the University of Senegal and the University of Michigan Dearborn Graduate School joins me to further examine the African diaspora, concept many viewers may not understand, but it implies the forcible removal of Africans to the Western Hemisphere and the Caribbean and Central America and Latin America. And he will also be talking about their attempts to establish a cultural identity through popular culture and communities that somehow escaped slavery, either through the Haitian Revolution or the Maroons and islands in the Caribbean. We'll also be discussing globalization and some of its effects on the African diaspora as expressed in Puerto Rico and comparing it with Cuba, where Dr. Santiago is also on the board of the History Museum in Havana. Hello, welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Lee Artz. I'm joined today by my guest, Dr. Santiago-Valles. We're going to discuss the African diaspora, globalization, and questions of race, among other things. Dr. Valles is the Professor Emeritus at Western Michigan University. He's also on the graduate faculty at the National University of Senegal and the University of Michigan Dearborn. He's on the editorial board of a number of journals. He's the past director of the Race and Ethnics Relation Institute at Western Michigan University. He's been a foreign correspondent. He's a teacher. He's a guest lecturer, a researcher, widely traveled to most continents of the world. And you're currently, I understand, a member of the international research team at the National Institute of History in Havana.
Yes.
I think that we should probably start by having some discussion or definition, maybe a short description of what do we mean by diaspora.
There are a group of social scientists, especially in the Caribbean, who have been working on this vocabulary, terminology, at least for the last 20 years. And one of them produced the definition that I prefer, which is that diaspora is the forceful displacement of a group of people who are transported to another part of the world in order to be forced to work without payment.
It's much different than the way that the diaspora is used in some discussions on international communication. I know Daya Thusso talks about the Indian or West Indian diaspora in the UK, and they talk about the Chinese diaspora in the Philippines or in Indonesia, just basically to mean movement of people. So how is this definition, it seems like this definition would apply almost exclusively to the African diaspora as opposed to an Indian or a Chinese diaspora?
I like this definition because it establishes the boundary between people who were forcefully displaced, that is, moved against their will and forced to accept conditions of slavery against their wishes, and people who are individual migrants or who are groups of people, as in the case of the Filipinos, who are contracted to work in Saudi Arabia, or people from India who were contract workers in Guyana during the 19th century, or Chinese workers who built the railroads of the United States. These were groups of people who were brought to work, and they were paid, and they were not forced to work under conditions that they could not negotiate, which is the case for the Africans who were kidnapped during 500 years since the 14th century and brought to the Americas or brought across the Mediterranean to Southern Europe against their wishes and forced to work for free under conditions which they could not negotiate.
So what does that do to the identity, the historic sense? Again, because if I'm thinking about people from Pakistan or India that moved to the UK for a job or for education and then they stay there, there's actually millions of West Asians in the UK, but they have connections back home. They have a language back home. They even get media back home. Whereas it would seem like the African diaspora, those things have been cut.
I think that the difference is markedly important. When I lived in East Africa, in Kenya and in Tanzania, every day at sunset, the East Indians would go to the waterfront and have an afternoon picnic looking towards India. They knew where India was. They knew what part of India they came from. They had correspondence with people there. For most of the people who were brought to the Caribbean, to North America, Central America, or South America, again, since the 15th century, that's not possible. It's not possible for us to know what part of the African continent we know we come from, with very rare exceptions. And I'll just name two. There's a book by Sylviane Diouf named Servants of Allah. Sylviane Diouf is a researcher at the Schomburg Center in New York City. And in that book, she identifies an order that was given by the Spanish crown that administered the colonies in the 16th century in Seville, in which people from Senegal could no longer be brought as slaves to Cuba, to Española, or to Puerto Rico, because these Wolof slaves had military experience, and they organized the slave insurrections in 1514 in my country, in 1522 in the now Dominican Republic, and all throughout the 16th century in Cuba.
They must have shared a language then as well.
Yes, they were all Muslims, they were all warriors, and some of them were religious scholars, so it was very easy to organize collective resistance. So by the third quarter of the 16th century, the Spanish crown made it impossible for people from Senegal to be kidnapped and brought to the Caribbean. But for the rest of the people in the Americas, again, with rare exceptions, the major one being people from Brazil, in the northeastern part of Brazil, most of the African diaspora in the Americas has very little connection with the place of their ancestors since the 16th century.
So they speak the language of whatever the colonial slave power was. So they'll speak Spanish or Portuguese or French or English, not a native tongue or not an indigenous language.
In most of the cases, the first means of communication between the slave masters and the forcefully enslaved was violence, was brutal force, was torture, or rape. The second language was a language that we invented. In the Caribbean, they're called Creoles, in order to bridge the gap between the language of the colonial masters or the slave masters and the language we speak with each other. There are several places in the Caribbean, in Central America and in South America, where people still speak the language of their ancestors, but it's mostly connected with religious rituals.
I wonder if there were, as part of that diaspora, even though you lose your language, you lose connection to your origin, by uniting, like in Barbados, did they develop other practices that drew on traditions, whether that might be music or cuisine or religious beliefs, other ways of maintaining some identity besides just their skin color?
When I was a student in Canada, one of the things that I was most interested in were processes of communication that have little or nothing to do with commercial media. So I studied popular culture, and again, popular culture as understood by some of my teachers, Paulo Freire, Jesus Martín Barbero, Anthony Wilden, the people that and Jesus Ibáñez from Spain, the people that I had studied with before. And they understand popular culture as the way daily life is organized against the dominant logic, the way we organize the hours of the day, the ways we communicate with each other, against the dominant logic, the way we organize work against the dominant logic. These are the elements that constitute popular culture. And in the Caribbean, in Central America, and in South America, again, we developed languages, written languages, like NCBD. In Haiti, similar language among Budung practitioners, in Cuba, in Brazil, in Puerto Rico.
Do these languages function now?
Yeah, they're still used now. You can ask veterans of the first American invasion of Haiti what was written on the ground when they landed, certainly not welcoming them. But in addition to the written languages, to the culinary practices, to the musical practices, what's most important in terms of processes of communication and popular culture is the way information is organized, vernacular ways of producing knowledge against the rationale of the dominant society. And those made it possible for us to invent societies beyond slavery. It made it possible for us to organize processes of making decisions beyond slavery and beyond colonialism and beyond capitalism. The best example historically, at least 200 years ago, would be the Haitian Revolution.
One of the things you said about the possibility of popular culture and the possibility of this diaspora finding a new way of being beyond slavery, you give the example of Haiti. You've also talked to me before about the Maroons in Barbados, and they were beyond slavery because they would move to the mountains, they could create their own language, their own ways of being, and I understand they continue to survive today. I wonder if there's anything that could be said about that understanding of an African diaspora and contemporary popular culture in the United States. I think of Black Lives Matter, and their vocabulary often sounds, even though it's in opposition to power and racism, it often sounds like they've accepted the same vocabulary of security, the right of police to be here. And I wonder if there's anything to be said from what you've learned about the attempts at equality or democracy or liberation in the diaspora as a whole, and what might be said about contemporary issues for African Americans.
Let me start with the last thing that you said. Democracy has little to do with voting. Yes. Voting is a sideshow, is a distraction. It's a process in which the workers have to choose between cancer and typhoid in terms of their options for making decisions. Democracy is about making all the decisions that affect our daily lives ourselves without representatives. It's all of us together making all of the decisions that affect our daily life. If I were talking to a group of European students, I would mention the Paris Commune. But in the Americas, there's an example that doesn't need to refer to the Paris Commune, and that is the communities of the Maroons. In every island where there were self-emancipated communities, whether it was Cuba, Haiti, Jamaica, the Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, Mexico, Venezuela, Brazil, Colombia, in each one of those cases, the people who were there made the conscious choice to produce what they needed collectively, as opposed to producing for the international market. Haitians were forced to produce sugar, indigo, and several other products for the French factories.
And lost all their trees in the process.
Exactly. But in the Maroon communities all across the Americas, in Central America, South America, and the Caribbean, the first thing that we did was to decide who was going to do the producing, what we were going to produce, and how we were going to divide the consequences of that production process. In the United States today, the barrios, the ghettos, the Indian reservations, the Chinatowns are domestic colonies. They're colonies inside the United States in which the uniformed slave patrols, now called police, have become the occupying army. And insofar as the people inside those domestic colonies can learn about self-emancipating processes in the Caribbean, in Central America, in South America, it might help them figure ways in order to emancipate themselves and in order to end the police violence that has multiplied fourfold since the period of Jim Crow in the United States.
So drawing some lessons from history of Maroon independence, Maroon liberation,
The
but
Garvey
put it in the 21st century as opposed to the 19th
The Garvey
century.
movement is a good example, which is a consequence of the traditions of
The Garvey
Maroon
movement in the 1920s.
in the 1920s. The Rastafarian movement in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and 60s had another kind of imaginary which was based on self-sufficiency and ending dependence, economic, cultural, media dependence, military dependence on somebody else to take care of your affairs and on being self-sufficient. And we can learn from those processes of self-sufficiency, of self-emancipation, on having another collective imaginary that doesn't depend on Europe and that doesn't depend on the bankers and it does not depend on the professional politicians.
I'd like to stay in contemporary times then, because I'd like, I know you're from Puerto Rico.
Thank God.
Well, you don't want to be there from today, which is my question. That globalization is often seen as this international competition between peoples, but I was struck by the media coverage of the hurricane that hit Puerto Rico compared to the media coverage of the hurricane that hit Houston, Texas. And when you talk about the lessons that can be learned, one of the lessons may be that the Puerto Ricans are really dependent upon political and economic decisions from the greater U.S. And I wondered if you could compare it all, the response to the hurricane in Puerto Rico and the response to the hurricane in Cuba, which it will give me a segue to end with my question on Cuba.
In England, there's a social scientist and librarian named Sivanandang from Sri Lanka who says that immigrants and exiles and refugees are the new settlers of Europe and of North America. And Sivanandang, when he's asked why are his people in England, he says because the British are in his country, that we're here because you're there.
Yeah.
And the same is the case with those of us from Puerto Rico who are forced to live abroad against our wishes. None of us come to the United States because we like the weather here. None of us come to the United States because we like the food here. Certainly not the coffee. We come to the United States because our country is under military occupation by the United States, and we're forced to work for 1/3 of the salaries, producing 40% more than the average American worker, and forced to live under conditions where the cost of living is 25% higher than it is in the United States. American investors double their investment every year on the backs of the workers in our country. And as a result of the way Americans have organized, American investors and American soldiers and American banks have organized the economy, 1/3 of the population, 1/3 of the working population is permanently unemployed, and that has been the case for over 60 years. Under those conditions, what is happening now in our country is a consequence of policies that were made by people that we do not elect, by people that Americans don't elect either. They're the banks and the political action committees that have decided to take the jobs out of our country and impose conditions that are going to force most of the population to leave the country so the country can be turned into a play yard for senior citizens from the United States or Hollywood stars.
It won't be much of a play yard if it's devastated repeatedly by hurricanes. So.
Well, that's the problem that we have insofar as environmental crises are connected with financial crises, are connected with the incompetence of colonial administrators, and are connected with the war industry in the United States that needs to have a radar in Puerto Rico to intervene in the communications of everybody that the Pentagon doesn't like in Central and South America. Puerto Rico is a good spy agency location for the United States, a good location for political police from the United States, and a good place for drugs, for casinos, for prostitution, and for tourism. That doesn't require any of the people who were born and educated there to participate. It's like Americans going to Africa to see the animals without ever having to shake the hand of an African.
Or watching a Disney movie.
Exactly.
I'm struck by the similarities between Puerto Rico and Cuba in the sense that there was a large African population, and of course the mixture with the Spanish colonialists. They're both island communities, they're similar in population, but it also strikes me that there's a radical difference between the quality of life between Puerto Rico and Cuba. And I'd like to end with you talking perhaps a little bit about the National Institute of History in Havana and the work you're doing with Antonio Maceo. Part of it is that I understand that Afro-Cubans make up a sizable part of the population, but the few times that I was there, I could not find a ghetto, I could not find segregated schools, I could not find nutrition or health care that was discriminatory by race. So I just wonder how your work on Antonio Maceo, and maybe you could explain who that is a reflection of the status of certain, well, Afro-Cubans in particular, in that society compared to Puerto Rico or our society.
In the last 200 years, both of our countries, Cuba and Puerto Rico, have been working together to expel first the Spaniards and later the American occupation since 1898. So we have been collaborating for over 200 years to expel the occupying army, the occupying banks, the occupying merchants. Maceo was a black self-taught person from the Orient in Cuba, the son of a woman from Haiti and a man from Venezuela, who with his 7 brothers and sisters rose in through the ranks of the independence armies. When the first insurrection was defeated, he had to move to Jamaica, and from there traveled all over Central America and the Caribbean. I'm part of a research team that includes historians from the Dominican Republic and Cuba as well, who are trying to reconstruct the letters and documents that were produced by his team during those 20 years between 1878 and 1898. I could not refuse this invitation because Maceo wrote a letter saying that as soon as they liberated Cuba, he was going to lead the group that was going to liberate my country. In the trips that I have made to Cuba, I have never seen a child beggar in the street. No. Like I have seen in the United States, here in Indiana, in Illinois, and in Michigan. I've never seen the need to carry a gun in Cuba, where in my country or in the United States, if I don't carry a gun, I'm practically committing suicide, given the level of police violence in the streets of the neighborhoods where I'm allowed to walk in the United States. And the most important distinction between Puerto Rico and Cuba refers us back to what we were saying about the Maroons. The Cubans are independent, they are sovereign. The American military base inside Cuba, where the American military practices torture, is there against the wishes of the Cubans and in violation of every decision that the Cubans have made. The military bases in the rest of Central America and including the Caribbean, one of them being my country, are there due to impositions of the American government, and we're not allowed to make any decisions about it.
We never have enough time at the roundtable perspective to pursue each of those things. It would be nice to be able to compare Puerto Rico and Cuba some more, and to talk about the sovereignty, which seems to be a word since the United Nations recent events that we would like to talk about with Cuba. But that's all the time we have. Thank you for coming.
You're welcome.
I want to thank the students that helped produce this. Thank Dr. Santiago-Valles for joining me today on Roundtable Perspectives. I'm Lee Artz, and I'll see the rest of you next time, and perhaps we can have you come back again.
I'd love to.
Thank you.